Okay. Welcome, everybody. We're still gathering people. And if you haven't yet, please feel free to put your name and DSA chapter, if you have one, in the chat. I'm Michaela Brangen, use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of the National Political Education Committee and River Valley DSA in Western Massachusetts. Thanks so much for attending this panel on DSA's labor strategy, which is hosted by the NPEC. The NPEC was formed in early 2020 in response to a 2019 convention resolution that made political education a top national priority. In the 2021 and 2022 term, we have a robust mandate and plan to host many more events, launch a regular newsletter full of political education writing, reviews, and resources, and do lots more chapter support and outreach. So education isn't the only part of a balanced socialist breakfast, but it's pretty important. For DSA to work, we need to be able to think and analyze our work in the context of history and strategy together. And the NPEC is aiming to make that part of our collective growth and as accessible and as useful as possible. Our next event will be July 18th at 7 p.m. And it'll be called How Can We Make DSA Anti-Racist and Multiracial? Like this event and the one we hosted on June 15th on socialism and electoral politics, this one will address our potential strategies as represented by various convention resolutions, and will feature different writers and activists who've worked on this before. So please mark your calendars for this call on July 18th, and details will be coming out in the following days. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists and our moderator. So Ashley Payne uses she, her pronouns and has been active in the East Bay DSA chapter of California's Bay Area since 2017. She's currently on the National Steering Committees of the Growth and Development Committee, which is the GDC, and the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission, the DSLC, where she also serves as co-chair. She's first vice president in her SEIU 1021 chapter and is a Central Labor Council delegate in Contra Costa County, California. Chris Maizano is a member of New York City DSA. He's been involved in labor work as both a rank and filer and staffer, and writes about labor for Jacobin, Catalyst, and DSA Socialist Forum. Cody Eaton is an Amazon worker at a delivery station in the Bronx, where he and his coworkers started the DNJ3 chapter of Amazonians United NYC. AU is a grassroots effort of, by, and for Amazon workers devoted to keeping workers informed on Amazon's tactics, taking collective shop floor action to address workplace issues, and building community. Cody is also a member of the NYC DSA Bronx, Upper Manhattan, and labor branches. And Lisa Zhu is a member of Boston DSA and previously a co-chair of its labor working group, as well as a member of BDSA AFRISOC. She is currently a staff organizer for Unite All Workers for Democracy, a UAWD, a rank and file caucus in UAW led primarily by auto workers with a growing support in other sectors of the union. She was also formerly a member of and staff organizer for UAW Local 5118, the Harvard Graduate Students Union. So I just want to go over the basic structure of the call, just to let everyone know. We're not going to close chat during the event, but please conduct yourself as though you were in real life. So feel free to express comradely feelings and try to be brief. Don't do long side conversations. And if you do have a question that you want a panelist to answer, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. Don't put it into the chat because it might get lost in there among everything else, but please do put it into the Q&A down there at the bottom. Lisa is going to guide discussion between our panelists for around 45 minutes. And if there's anything that comes up for you while they're in conversation, feel free to type it into the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen, just pointed out. So while that's going on, we'll either work it into the discussion as it's going, or we can save them until after, when we will have a dedicated Q&A session, which will conduct until we're done, which won't go past 7:30. So once again, we're actually a little bit ahead of time. I don't have anything else. And so without further ado, I'm going to unspotlight myself and turn it over to Lisa. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Michaela. It's great to see all the panelists and everyone who came today. Thank you for joining us. This should be a really interesting discussion. I'm gonna start it off by asking each of the panelists in turn the question, from where you sit in the movement, what are the biggest issues or challenges in building labor power right now? So I'm gonna go in alphabetical order, starting with Ashley. So just 2 or 3 minutes, and then so we can give everyone a chance to go around.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So as Michaela said, I have a lot of different titles. So because of that, I'm sort of in an interesting sort of like intersection in the labor movement, being on the Labor Council. So I hear what priorities are in the AFL-CIO, sort of the official, federation of all the labor unions in the United States. I'm active in my union, which is a big mega local in Northern California that goes basically from San Francisco to Oakland up to the Oregon border and the Nevada border. So it's 65,000 members. And then of course, being in DSLC, I'm hearing about stuff, labor work all over the country. And so one of the things that's very apparent, and, there's 2 things I want to sort of think about it, is like the organized labor movement's challenges, and then like the wider, broader working classes unorganized. Within the organized labor movement, which rank and file members are a part of, is like trying to sort of combat apathy and really getting people to sort of think about unions as a political vehicle, as somewhere that they actually have power and they can use to like actually make changes. I think there's been decades of, business unionism, sort of like meat and potatoes, contract enforcement, and just looking after people's wages and retirements. But that has led us to the situation that we're in now, where the labor movement is shrinking. We're at 10% of the overall workforce. That's very low. Like, I think our peak was around 30%. So we have to revitalize and our current unions that we have. People have to become more active, more militant. We need to remember our history, build that militant layer of shop floor organizers. Shop floor sounds kind of jargony, but it just means like your work site. So if you work in an office or you work in the regional parks or wherever your work site is, the place that you actually work with your coworkers, that's what we mean when we say shop floor organizer. So that's a huge priority is like making those militant, democratizing them again so that workers actually have real power and control over their unions to build that kind of power. The other piece is majority of people in the working class are not in unions. They don't have that kind of power on the job. So the best way to organize all those folks are through unions. So that's why like organizing existing rank and file members is so important to get control, because they know like most of their friends, most of their relatives are not in unions. They know that their lives are better being in a union. So we have to like force unions to take on that priority to really expand and build the labor movement up and start organizing new places. We've seen a lot, recently in the last few years, which is really exciting, but it needs to be much bigger. And we're going to talk about a lot of that a little bit later, so I won't get ahead of myself.
Yeah, no, these are definitely things that the labor resolution I'll be asking you about speak to. Yeah, thank you so much. So Chris, same question. From where you sit in the movement, what are the biggest issues or challenges in building labor power right now?
Sure, thanks, Lisa. It's good to see my fellow panelists here, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I'm very happy to spend some time here with all of you. I'm going to tackle 3 kind of very broad points, I suppose, and I hope we get to talk about them more in the Q&A. The first is that, at least from my point of view, the U.S. labor movement finds itself trapped in what seems to be a really difficult sort of double bind. On the one hand, it can't make new breakthroughs or exercise power without a major shift in the broader political terrain. But at the same time, it can't reshape that broader political terrain without exercising a level of power that it currently does not have. And I don't think it's going to be able to do that on its own for many reasons. Perhaps we could talk about that in the Q&A. So I think unless labor can forge stronger alliances with the resurgent left, and that certainly includes DSA, but I think, I would cast the net much more widely than that when I say left, and reorient itself towards a more kind of wide-ranging strategy of popular mobilization. Labor, I think, is going to keep struggling to defend itself, much less make new gains. That's, of course, much easier said than done, for sure, but I think that's got to be the kind of overarching strategic goal. So what can an organization like DSA do to help overcome this dilemma or bind? In general, I think the task for us is to try to achieve what our predecessors a century ago called the merging of socialism and the workers' movement. But this is a really big country. It's got very uneven levels of workers' organization. We see legal and institutional arrangements that vary from state to state or from one sector to another. And you find really different political contexts that might be more or less hospitable to unionization and working class organizing generally, depending on where you are. So an approach that might make sense for New York City, where I live, it might not make as much sense in places where unions are essentially non-existent, or where the political climate is extremely hostile to labor organizing in any kind of form. So that being said, I think there's no probably magic bullet or one-size-fits-all kind of solution here to effecting this merger of socialism and the workers' movement. I think the most important thing at this point in the game is just making contact with and helping to build the organizing and political capacities of as many working people as possible. The specific ways that we go about doing this, I think, are less important and should be subjected to as much trial and error as possible. And I would also note that this kind of work should definitely not be restricted to narrowly economic or workplace issues, but to the extent that it's possible, to try to address every single issue and problem of importance to working people. And then the third point that I kind of just very briefly wanted to touch on here and just kind of put out there is maybe something of like a provocation or an invitation to a discussion is, the question of whether the age of what you might call the labor upsurge, a la the 1930s, is effectively over. I think we have to grapple with the possibility that, among many other things, the erosion of the industrial working class, which in many cases was the leading edge of labor movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, means that it very well might be. Industrial workers' power didn't just stem from their strategic location in the heart of the production process. But in addition to that, if you look back at the historical record, the patterns of industrialization that we see in the US and elsewhere also tended to concentrate workers from the same or similar workplaces together in big urban neighborhoods. And what this all did was enhance people's capacity to do things like form trade unions, political parties, and other forms of working class organization. So industrial workers were able historically to combine the disruptive potential that they had in their workplaces, these big, huge factories that industrial workers tended to work in many decades ago, with organizing capacity in other sections of the working class have typically not been able to do. And I think this unique combination really powered many of the victories that working people in countries like the US and elsewhere were able to win in the 19th and 20th centuries. And for me, the upshot of that is if the conditions that made that kind of very unique combination possible have passed into history, then I think it stands to reason that the overall workplace bargaining power, at least, of the working class has declined. And I think we can, if we think that that's true, and I think that's open for debate, then I think we have to grapple with what the consequences of that would be. None of that, of course, is to suggest that working class organizing is doomed to failure, not by any means. But what I think it does mean, at least in my view, is that the potential for making new advances today seems relatively more dependent on, and I use this term very broadly speaking, political action, rather than leveraging workers' strategic location in kind of the production process and things like that. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to talking more with all of you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That really covered a lot of ground. And I was planning to ask you again about this
this article that you wrote called Labor's Double Bind that came out in the Catalyst Journal a few months ago. Yeah, I think you're right. There is like this tension between, you know, the shop floor organizing and the broader political normalization that I mean, like, you know, I think both needs to happen, but you're right. What's more important? So yeah, let's go to Cody to answer the same question. From where you sit in the movement, what are the biggest issues or challenges in building labor power right now?
Absolutely. Very happy to be here. Thank you, everyone. So I've worked for Amazon for about 10 months now. I was an Amazon worker before I was a member of DSA. And I think that speaks to a lot of the way my opinions have formed within my brief time in the labor movement. But if you ask me, it's that we are not energized in the way that we need to be if we want to make serious gains. The point Chris just talked about is absolutely true. There's that duality. But if something like the PRO Act is ever going to get passed, it's not going to be just because it seems politically convenient. It's going to be because the working class actually applied enough pressure to make it unavoidable. And I think we're sadly far off from that point right now. But in order to get to that point, we talk about DSA members, what can we do? What can socialists, what can people on the left, what can anyone in the labor movement do to advance this broader goal of having a country where the private sector unionization rate is more than dismal 6%? It means sacrifice to me. We need people that are willing to re-energize the labor movement by being there on the ground, potentially moving boxes 30 to 50 hours a week. It's not fun. I don't enjoy my job very much, but considering the behemoth that Amazon is, you quite literally just need long enough to make anything happen. The recent the turnover rate at Amazon is 3%, which on average produces an entirely new workforce every 8 months. And those numbers are pre-COVID. So we obviously have a gargantuan task, but there are plenty of unemployed socialists out there, I'm sure. And if even a small fraction of them were to get a job at Amazon, truly embed themselves in the lives of their coworkers, reach people that thus far DSA has not been able to consistently reach and bring into what we want to be a working class movement. Until we make those connections, there will continue to be this huge disconnect. We'll continue to have things like, these webinars that are great and helpful, but my coworkers have no idea these exist. So until we build that bridge by truly taking part in a workers' movement, especially in low-wage industries that might be less attractive to enter and toil in for years. So that's why I'm here today.
Thanks, Cody. Yeah, it's awesome that you're doing what you're doing. And I hope we will definitely talk more about Amazon during this hour. So thanks to everyone for answering that question in just such, I don't know, really comprehensive and varied ways. I'm gonna turn it over to Ashley now to talk about this big labor resolution that's going to be put forward at the DSA convention this summer. And I think this is a good place to continue the discussion because it touches on so many of the things we've just talked about: organizing the unorganized, encouraging DSA members to take jobs in strategic industries, Amazon, legislative action. So I was wondering if you could, as one of the co-authors of the resolution, if you could give like a bullet point summary of what's in the resolution for people who haven't seen it yet. Maybe someone could even drop the link into the chat. And then after you give the summary, my question for you is, why did you as a DSLC member feel there was a need for a comprehensive labor strategy for DSA? And how can DSA best establish a significant, credible presence in the labor movement like we've been discussing?
Okay, so I just dropped the link into the convention packet. So the labor resolution is number 5, building worker power to win democratic socialism, labor strategy for DSA in 2021 to 2023. So this is a consensus resolution that reflects a lot of the work that we're already doing across lots of different areas of DSA and really sort of expanding and really building on that. So that's kind of where we're starting. And there's a lot of explanation actually if you want to read the packet through, but I'm going to go through the bullet points like Lisa said. So one of the things is continuing to make DSLC and labor work in DSA an organizational priority. DSA has 4 national priorities right now. DSA's labor work and DSLC is one of them. And so we want to continue prioritizing that work. Second point is organizing the unorganized. So that's not only continued support for the PRO Act, but there's other points too where, you know, different legislative action in different places, like in California, we did a lot of work around Prop 22, for example, and that was to make sure that gig workers weren't being misclassified as contractors. And if you've been watching that kind of news, there's a bill like that in New York right now that's kind of a watered down version. And so there's other places, and we need to really be on the lookout for that and organizing around it, because we do need to be taking power in the state as well. And I think somebody just wrote in the chat, also in Massachusetts. So yep, there we go. So this is very important that we're also organizing on this front, because unions have big political departments where they put a lot of money behind this and they put a lot of focus and effort behind it. So we need to be also there in motion with them. The next one is supporting efforts to organize Amazon. So, you know, Cody's speaking to that. I don't really want to cover a ton about it, but, you know, Amazon's this big behemoth and is a sort of an existential threat to a lot of other logistics unions. So we do really need to take it seriously. And that's why, you know, this particular employer is kind of singled out here. We want to continue supporting our work with EWOC, the Emergency Worker Organizing Committee, and our partnership with UE. It's pretty phenomenal at all that we have a partnership with an established union as a socialist organization. You know, there was a long period of time where, you know, unions didn't want to touch a socialist organization. So we really want to help local labor formations also build their organizing drives as well and build those partnerships in their regions. We also want to encourage and organize current union members to push their unions to do more new organizing, which I touched on a little bit, and I'm sure we'll talk about more. And this is the part about actual rank and file members taking control of their unions to make this a priority. That's the best way that's going to happen, is tapping into that history, that skill set that established unions have. It's very difficult for an organization like DSA to go in and do that new organizing. It's really best if the established, like, organized labor movement actually takes that control. We want to support rank and file workers to democratize their union and support common good causes. So that means bargaining for the common good, social justice, unionism. You know, you've heard about the Chicago Teachers Union during COVID organizing around eviction moratoriums, UTLA, the Teachers Union LA, organizing for green space and getting cops out of schools. You know, all of these things, we're regular people too. These things affect us. You know, union members are renters, union members send their kids to public school and are subjected to police brutality. So we need to bring the public together with the unions, because oftentimes what happens is employers want to drive wedges between the working class, sort of saying, look, people at BART are keeping you from go to work or going to see your family and friends because they're greedy and they want their fancy pensions and their wages. We want to make sure that that does not happen. And so we have to continue building that work. And there's a lot of unions who don't do that, and there are a lot of unions who do, but that needs to be the status quo in the labor movement more widely. The next piece is organizing sort of sectoral networks or industrial networks or union networks. You know, there's big unions like the one I'm in that has 2 million members nationally. We could be organizing networks across the country for SEIU members, Teamsters, et cetera. That work is starting to happen. We want to continue prioritizing that kind of work. We also want to organize by industry as well. So we want entertainment workers organizing or healthcare workers organizing across the country. We want to make sure that happens. We really want to get to the place that there's like a floor that nobody goes below, because we have right to work states and some states that are collective bargaining states, and you know, if you're in Alabama, you're gonna be making a lot less than people who work in California. And we wanna kind of get rid of that sort of discrepancy and that disparity. And the only way you can do that is really by organizing across states and workplaces and doing that sort of level of sectoral organizing that you see, you know, in places like Sweden. We also want to continue to support the creation of job pipelines. Yes, people are listing in the chat examples. Yes, the Restaurant Organizing Project has been phenomenal. They've done a lot of really good work. And there's a number of networks that are going, and they're definitely a highlight. So job pipelines is the next point that we want to continue doing. A lot of chapters are building pipelines around getting socialists into the rank and file of unions. So this is what Chris was, you know, touching on about merging the socialist movement and the labor movement and making sure that people are actually organizing with labor, but have that socialist outlook and pulling labor to the left and making these unions militant and democratic and organized again. And the last two pieces are more like housekeeping things about continuing to do membership meetings for DSLC membership within DSA, and then hiring a full-time staffer to support all of this work. So again, I'm sure that was a little lengthy, but I put the link in the chat and you can, you know, review the resolution. It's number 5.
Cool, thanks, Ashley. That's great. Yeah, there's so much in the resolution, and you know, when I read it, I was like, oh, cool. Our chapter is already doing a lot of these things. It felt like it was very like good to see all of it compiled in one resolution. So yeah, I wanted to invite Chris and Cody if you want to. I don't know if you've seen the resolution, if you want to comment on it, or you know, we could, you know, if there's another angle you want to give to this question of what should be the role of socialists and DSA in labor organizing.
Yeah, I'll speak to that briefly. I know Daphne sent me a copy of the resolution, and the Amazon section is not extensive at the moment.
Mhm.
And so I guess what I have to add there is that, yes, it's good to support you know, any efforts that are going on at Amazon. We saw lots of, you know, support rallies and whatnot for the Bessemer effort. But I think we'd be making a major mistake if we think that DSA wants to just be on the sidelines cheerleading in this effort. We are at a moment in time where socialists are and can continue to really shape the strategy and the ways that organizing at Amazon is undertaken. It was Amazonians United Chicago that led one of the first walkouts in 2019 that got any significant attention, organizing around, you know, solid issues like having access to water. And if we kind of just take a step back and wait for, you know, whichever union to try whichever strategy that may or may not be overly dependent on an national labor relations board that we know is structured to benefit companies, will just be biting the dust. So if there are any socialists on this call, or any that you know that want to actually do something about Amazon, that might very well look like getting a job and toiling there for a while. Yes, comment girl, your roommate, let her know, email us, nyc@amazoniansunited.org. If someone can put that in the chat, that'd be greatly appreciated. But there's a lot that socialists could do at Amazon. And I think that's really up to folks to take initiative and ownership over that project, because we have already started doing it. Thanks to Amazonians United, part-time workers that were not getting paid time off after an effort coordinated between 3 warehouses, the petition campaign, that change was made nationwide. So if that's what we're doing with 3 warehouses, imagine what else we're capable of when we have a stronger network of committed people that want to hold Amazon accountable and build real worker power.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, I'm going to pivot a little bit, and I'll definitely give Chris a chance to respond to either question, just because we had a question from the audience that touches on the rank and file strategy. And for those who don't know what that is, it's the name of a pamphlet that was written by Kim Moody, and it describes the orientation that socialists should take toward the labor movement, specifically in building up the layer of rank and file organizers, as we've actually been discussing on this call. And one tactic described in the pamphlet is encouraging socialists to take jobs in strategic workplaces like Amazon now. So the question from the audience member is, what do DSA advocates of the rank and file strategy make of the criticism of this tactic as sectarian or even vanguardist? I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that now, but I figured I'd throw it in since we're talking about the tactics of encouraging socialists to take jobs, not just in Amazon, but also schools and hospitals and a lot of logistics as well.
Sure, I'll take a first stab at it. I guess the first thing I would say is, at least from my perspective, I think a lot of times when, this idea or this concept is discussed or debated in various ways, it's not always clear exactly how the term or the concept is being defined, and what either advocates or opponents of this orientation are addressing or trying to address. From my own point of view, it's a mistake to reduce this concept or this phrase or this orientation only to the idea that socialists should get jobs either in already unionized workplaces or occupations with the intention of becoming active in whatever union may exist there, or trying to organize in an unorganized setting. From my own point of view, at least, I think that can and should be one aspect of this general approach, but it's not, I think, the only one. Depending on the specific kind of situation that people might be finding themselves in, it might not even be the most effective way to go about doing it. At least from my point of view, the intention of this idea is precisely to do what, I think all of us have been hitting on from the beginning of the panel, which is the idea that for quite a long time and for many different reasons, socialist politics on the one hand and, what you could broadly call the workers' movement on the other hand, have been separated. They've been apart, to a significant extent, been driven apart, by various forms of repression and, other measures and tactics that have been, adopted specifically to drive a wedge between, the left, broadly speaking, and, labor unions, workers' organizations in general. So the intention is to try to the extent that it's possible, recreate those connections, recreate that relationship between socialists on one hand, the workers' movement on the other, so that socialists don't fall into the isolation and every bad thing that comes along with it that we have tended to be stuck in over the past few decades, but hopefully are starting to, pull ourselves out of now. And then on the other hand, having a workers' movement, having a labor movement that is extremely narrowly focused on kind of the most limited conceptions of trade unionism and workers' organization. Forms that are very much focused on just collective bargaining at the lowest possible level, defending the status quo as it already exists, whatever that might be that people have been able to achieve over the years, and to kind of pursue accommodations and and agreements with management rather than mobilizing their own members and then the community and working people at large. Not just to make gains at the level of an individual workplace or an employer, but, in the society as a whole. So, from my point of view, at least that's, this kind of broader goal of reconnecting working people and their organizations on the one hand, and socialists and their organizations on the other hand, is really what is at stake in saying that you support something like, the rank and file strategy, if you want to call it that. It's not just, socialists who have been to college, getting some job and parading around, telling people that, I have the truth, come and follow me, I'll set you free, or something like that. It's not, if someone is trying to do it that way, then I would think we should pull them aside and tell them not to do it that way. But the goal is really to try to bring socialists and working people back together after decades and decades and decades of us being split apart, and in many cases pulled apart by our political and other antagonists.
I also want to take a stab at this question a little bit too. I don't think it's sectarian for socialists to go into the labor movement and face the same struggles and challenges that the people that we're advocating for. I think standing side to side, like shoulder to shoulder, facing those same struggles together means that you have a different level of credibility because you're facing the same risks. If you're going to go march on the boss together, you're not standing out on the outside with perfect politics saying, well, you should be voting your contract down, but you're not actually facing the same risks of paying for your housing, making sure you have childcare for your children, or being able to make sure that you can get cancer treatment for your partner. Like, I think that's very important to make sure that this is what bringing those movements means, is that you're not standing on the outside. Standing on the outside and having perfect politics, to me, is what sectarianism is. Not going into the labor movement and actually fighting side by side with people. I don't think that's sectarianism at all. Whether or not it's vanguardist, maybe some of the language, like a militant minority that Kim Moody says sounds like elitist or vanguardist. But really, we're just talking about building that layer of leaders in the workplace that can continue that fight and have continuity. Because, as Chris said, there's been a break over many decades between the socialist movement and the labor movement. If you, look back at history, some of the best organizers were socialists, like in the CIO and from the Communist Party. And a lot of those folks were the ones that were really pushing labor to make those really big gains and those really big leaps. And it's because we have this particular analysis about class struggle and about class politics and capitalism. And the labor movement is here constantly doing class politics, but is it always like in this way that's going to move us to social democracy and socialism in a place where we can abolish capitalism? Not always. We've seen that people sometimes just look out for their wages and their benefits, and the AFL-CIO is very guilty of doing that for a lot of decades and just solving problems around the table and cutting deals that most of the rank and file have no idea and maybe don't agree with. And again, oftentimes the rank and file is a lot more radical than the leadership is. So I think that doesn't make it vanguardist either, because again, you're struggling together. The best way to build relationships is by struggling together. That's how it happens. So I think this is one of the best ways to do it rather than being on the outside.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I want to give Cody a chance to respond to that too, since you're advocating, for socialists to take jobs in strategic sectors. And also, I want to follow up on the question of what else you think DSA members could be doing to support organizing in Amazon as well, in addition to this tactic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree with the other panelists that if you're struggling together, it's a lot different. And so the notion of something being, just vanguardist, I think kind of ignores a lot of the history of organizing in the US. I think there's this, I'm not sure why it's so persistent, but this common idea that this romanticized vision that, workers just rise up all the time. It happens. It's like throughout history, the best organizers were frequently leftists, and they would get purged from unions after their helpful work was done. But there's a long history of leftists with that vision clearly articulated, building relationships and building solidarity, building shop floor power to bring about the victories that we owe so much to. So I think one more narrow critique of what has been perceived as the rank and file strategy within DSA is that there's this notion that, we'll become union members, and then we'll form the union, and then we'll do new organizing. And while I understand it's not mutually exclusive, for me, I think for all of us, there is an absolute sense of urgency. Amazon's about to become the second, well, it's currently the second, about to become the largest employer in the country, and is churning through bodies, especially Black and brown ones, that make up over 60% of their shop floor workforce. So yes, the rank file strategy brings socialists and working class closer together, and I absolutely support that. But doing it in non-unionized workplaces should also be an urgent priority, because by the time we get, X union to the state we want it at, it could very well be too late. So I'll add that there. Aside from that, I mean, we do get this question a lot. My local labor manager is like, oh, like, what can we do? How can we help? And it might sound repetitive at this point, but really what we need are more people that are willing to move boxes 30 to 50 hours a week. It's been a lot easier to recruit people to the Solidarity Committee of Amazonians United than it has been to get people to get jobs. So we're going to keep hammering that. If you know anyone in your community, your neighbors, family, at this point, everyone seems to know someone that works at Amazon. Let them know that Amazonians United exists, that if they want our support in trying to help organize at their warehouse, their facility, we would love to talk. But we need more people on the ground. We're under-resourced. It's going to take a lot to inflict the type of damage we'd like to against this disgusting company. But there's a chance, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. So I know at the end of this call, we're going to be dropping some links in the chat, and I'm sure there'll be more links related to Amazonians United as well that we definitely encourage everyone to check out. So I want to move on to another topic that was Ashley mentioned earlier, but brought up in the labor resolution. And we also got an audience question that's kind of related as well. So practically speaking, what does it mean for DSA to focus on organizing the South? And we had an audience question asking for advice for folks in rural and conservative areas trying to organize, which I think is a somewhat related question. So yeah, so feel free to answer either one. And I don't know, I'll turn it, since Cody just spoke, I'll turn it back over to Ashley if you want to give that a shot.
Organizing South is difficult, but organizing's still organizing. You still have to do some back to basics organizing. You still have to organize the shop floor. There's going to definitely be different challenges to overcome and priorities. In the South, there's a very different history there. Racism is not unique to the South, but it may be something that you do need to prioritize there. And honestly, labor tries to do it. They give a lot of lip service to it, but they, those efforts kind of pan out differently. And so you just have to put in the resources and the effort to do that, because as long as you have a region that's not organized, it's going to draw down sort of the potential for the rest of the labor movement in other places, because employers can always outsource their jobs there to Tennessee and Alabama and sort of bring down the floor for everybody. And so we just have to spend a lot of resources, and maybe it needs to get to the point where like unions are funding people to move down there, build roots there, stay there, and really commit to staying in those states for a few decades, because it does take a while to trust people, to have that credibility with folks on the shop floor. But the back to basics organizing, really having control of your union and really having it be democratic so that members can really decide, that's ultimately how you're going to be able to make that a priority. And if we don't do that and get people to sort of take control of their unions again and not just deliver on sort of the meat and potatoes issues, then we're not going to be able to prioritize organizing the South anyway. So it's a little tricky. There's a particular history. There's a lot of good books about organizing the South. We actually did an educational series about it with Michael Goldfield called The Southern Key about organizing the South. That has a lot of good case studies about different failures, but there's also a lot of different wins that have happened in the South too. It's not impossible to organize. You know, there's still workers, they're still facing they still have unsafe working conditions. That's everywhere. So I think we just unions have to make that a priority. And the only way it can become a priority is if members in their unions take control of their unions to make that a priority.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Chris and Cody, do you want to add anything to this question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've never lived outside of a 90-mile triangle of like Brooklyn, Philadelphia, New Jersey, so I don't have any tips to offer about rural organizing at all. I won't even pretend. So sorry about that. But at least from afar, it seems like when it comes to organizing a region like the South, where you're not just dealing with kind of the basic impediments that capitalism as an economic system throws up to any group of workers trying to organize, no matter where they are. You have on top of that the added level of just like general political hostility, to working class organizing generally, and to the left in general, which I can only imagine just makes something that is already kind of the hardest thing in the world, which is organizing working people, even more difficult. And it seems even more difficult to do now that unions in other parts of the country, which in previous decades when they were larger and had more resources, did make some attempts to try to mobilize and marshal their resources into organizing these largely unorganized regions, are just struggling to keep their own heads above water in many cases these days. So I think that makes it really difficult. My own sense is, if you're like a DSA person, or member of a DSA chapter, in kind of like a more rural or conservative area, whether it's in the South or somewhere else, and especially if social life in general is just kind of unorganized, if you're like kind of in a more ex-urban place or a more rural place, people have to drive everywhere. Cultural organizations might not exist a lot in many cases, etc. I don't know, it might be worth, I don't know if organizing people in the workplace in these sorts of regions or places is going to start maybe directly at the level of the workplace. And again, this is just my own speculation, but it seems like, something to do in these sorts of areas is to try to move the needle as much as you can, kind of at the level of just sort of the general political climate of the area, by having media, running political campaigns, just being visible and out there in every way that it's possible, just to try to start establishing connections with people, spread our ideas, and grow our movement to the extent that that's possible. And hopefully in that kind of process, you start to, build relationships with people, activate them in various ways, get them thinking about how the world works, and that they don't, whatever situation that they find themselves in, it's not set in stone, it's not fate, and that they can potentially change it if they get together with their coworkers or, whoever the case may be. So yeah, again, this is just speculation on my part, but it seems like in many cases that might be a really good use of a lot of DSAers' time and energy in these sorts of places where, labor as an organized movement doesn't really exist to a big extent, and where the political climate is just fairly hostile to workers' organization. But if I'm entirely wrong about that, which I may be, because I'm sitting here in the middle of Flatbush, Brooklyn, please correct me. But that's kind of my speculation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of resonates with, again, this double bind that you were talking about, where, on sometimes we really need to look at what's going on outside of the shop floor in order to kind of, you know, make progress in organizing in the workplace as well. So,
Can I add something really quick? I
yeah,
just wanted to say, like, one of the things that is everywhere are like post offices. They have union workers, K through 12 education. The teacher strike kicked off in West Virginia, a very red state. You know, Arizona did a lot of work around that. It's not impossible to do, but public sector unionism too. I mean, that's why bargaining for the common good and taking up those social justice issues in the larger community does matter. So those unions that are present in red states and in the South then have to pick up those fights around police brutality, around anti-racism, environmental pollution. They have to organize for those things too, if they want to start to shift the political environment that Chris was talking about in those states to make it more amenable or impossible really for the state to make, you know, different laws to make organizing easier. Again, another reason why the PRO Act is so important. So there are places that have union, you know, environments. You just have to go into them because K through 12 schools and post offices are everywhere.
Yeah, if I could just jump in again super fast. I actually, my partner and I just completed a 2-week road trip around America, which was great. I got to see a lot of places I didn't see. And yeah, I mean, our interaction with people and places was fairly superficial, but you know, it's like, no matter where we were, you know, it could have been, you know, whether this was Wyoming or South Dakota or God, where else were we? Kentucky, Mexico. No matter like where you went, you know, Ashley, you highlighting the Postal Service really resonated with me because no matter where we went, there was always a post office. There was always some kind of school. And, you know, in addition to lots and lots of churches that you see all over the place. And I think that's an interesting and difficult sort of institution to try to grapple with when it comes to these questions. But yeah, it struck me that like, hey, you know, if people are looking for inroads into building organization, you know, either kind of union organizations or politically, that seems like not a bad place to try to make some inroads. Also, you know, it's like here in a place like New York City, the Postal Service is enormously important for a lot of people. And, you know, the demand for postal banking, for example, is something that's come up here, you know, because there's always a post office, even in the poorest neighborhood. People want to get ripped off by, you know, check cashing companies and whatever. From what I understand, you know, this is also a problem in lots of rural areas too. So, you know, it seems like, you know, these sorts of, you know, limited but nonetheless important kinds of institutions that exist that may span these kinds of divides, maybe you know, places to kind of identify and look at.
I'm going to turn it over to Cody, and then I think we're actually bumping up against the beginning of the Q&A time. So maybe one of the other event coordinators let me know if we should transition after Cody. But Cody, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think just looking at recent history, the fact that the Bessemer campaign got as far as it did anyways is still a testament to the fact that there's the energy. The South can by no means be written off. I think the challenge is, of course, different. In my workplace, yeah, a lot of my coworkers have been union members. There's comparative little fear. No one said, oh, no, God, a union. And having worked in Texas for 6 months, yeah, I encountered a lot more of that there than I do here in New York. But at the same time, there's a deep, rich organizing tradition in Alabama. The militant Black steelworkers from decades ago, that energy is still there. Maybe not as potent as it once was, but I think to act as if we're starting from scratch is misguided. Not that anyone's necessarily saying that, but I think we just need to be aware of our history and be aware of what can be strengthened and rebuilt. Yeah, especially alongside with public sector unions. Because yeah, if West Virginia wasn't a good enough example, we'll continue to see these types of efforts if the energy is actually tapped into rather than just written off.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. And I think we now are supposed to begin our Q&A, but I'll say one question I unfortunately didn't get to is the question of how we prioritize Black and brown workers in struggle, and what is the relationship between labor organizing and fighting racism, which I think we've kind of touched on, but just didn't have enough time to really devote in this section. There was just too much to talk about. So yeah, I want to thank everyone for participating in this more structured part of the panel. And then I think I'm turning it over to Sanjeev now for the Q&A. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Lisa. And we'll just start with the last question Lisa raised. The resolution, emphasizes the need to organize workers of color and Black workers. So yeah, how do you all propose to do that?
Well, I do want to point out that actually Black workers compared to other groups are some of the more highly unionized groups. So that is something that already exists. So I just want to make sure people are aware of that. People might think like the labor movement is full of Joe the plumbers, but actually labor is full of people who look more like me, to be frank. So I just want to make sure that like there's a lot of fiery Black and brown women, non-men leaders in a lot of unions around the country, especially when you're looking at a lot of like the Fight for 15 and different hospitality unions, and like those are majority Black and brown unions. So I think, there's still a lot of sort of optics problems of the labor movement that I think we need to overcome that the data doesn't really actually support. But I'm not saying that doesn't mean we don't prioritize it. We continue to prioritize it because that's also where the demographics of this country are going as well too. But again, a lot of that is just, you have to pick issues that are broadly felt and deeply felt by members and by the community. And if that's police brutality like we saw last summer, then that's what you prioritize and you start organizing around. It was part of some efforts in my union to, get cops out of unions. I don't know if people saw what happened in Seattle. They got cops union out of that labor council. So there's definitely efforts to do that. There's a lot of work around unions are oftentimes part of coalitions to reallocate funding from police departments into social services, to maybe remove some of the work that really isn't appropriate for police to do and housing it in different places. So that is happening from labor. Like Richmond, California, the Reimagine Richmond Coalition just actually reduced funding for the police. They didn't defund it, but they did put some more money into homelessness services, youth services, all of these things that we actually need to support, that socialist support. If we're really serious about abolition or reducing the carceral state, these things affect union members too. And we have to remember also, like, the police go after unions too. We have a very bloody history of the US labor movement in this country. So we have to remember that the police are there to enforce private property. They're there for the ruling class. And that is something that that's not something that's separate from the labor movement. Of course, there's lots of different contradictions around that, but the only way, forward is through. And I think we just have to get more people in the labor movement, especially socialists, who keep these things, central to the organizing, and that we do the hard work of having those one-on-ones, the basic organizing of just finding out what those broadly felt and deeply felt issues are. And you will find those. I think I'll put the Reimagine Richmond stuff in the chat. It's pretty inspiring. It's really great.
Yeah, just briefly. I agree with everything that Ashley said. I particularly would underscore her point about, Black workers having the highest unionization rate in the country. I got my start as a unionist in the public sector here in New York City. And, when I was both a member and then a staffer for public sector unions, people like me were definitely not in the majority. So, I think in a lot of places, definitely in kind of your bigger or more metropolitan areas where in particular the public sector is fairly well organized. This is kind of, these issues and questions are kind of just, they come with the territory. Because of that reason, I think it's hugely important to have a really kind of strong orientation, particularly to public sector workers and public sector unions everywhere, all over the country. And again, that's going to look different depending on where you are. In a place like here in New York, you know, in the public sector, you have Scandinavian levels of union density and organization. In other places, you know, public sector workers are still fairly rightless. And, you know, there's a lot of organizing that still remains to be done in those sorts of places to establish that kind of baseline of political, legal, whatever kind of rights and freedoms to establish. You know, and in addition to, you know, what Ashley was talking about in terms of the issues that have come up in recent times that unions and other organizations have taken up, in addition to prioritizing and organizing in the public sector in particular, you know, I think that there are lots of potential inroads here, you know, not necessarily directly through, you know, labor organizing, you know, particularly because, as we've said on a few occasions, the vast majority of workers in the country are not organized. The vast majority of workers in the country are in the private sector, which is even less organized than the public sector. And, you know, in those cases, I think that we're going to have to try to figure out ways to, you know, use, and again, I use this term as broadly as possible, politics and political action in order to, you know, reach people that for whatever reason we're not going to be able to reach at the level of workplaces or through a union or things like that. You know, here in New York, we've had the good, you know, we've been able, thankfully, to elect, you know, a number of people to various offices at both the state and the local level. And, you know, one of the things that we want to try to do, you know, is not just to kind of like catapult individuals into office and then kind of wave them goodbye and say good luck and, you know, see what they come up with during the course of a legislative session. You know, one of the things that we want to do is, you know, use the elected offices that they've won to try to help organize people, you know, back home in the district. Not just to like put pressure on their legislators and what have you to pass specific bills and what have you, but to build organizational capacity in the district. And, you know, here in a place like New York, you know, a lot of that is going to be around trying to organize people around housing questions, about rent regulations, you know, various forms of development and what have you. And obviously that affects working class people as a whole in New York City. But, you know, the parts of the city that are particularly vulnerable to gentrification and redevelopment are, you know, Black working class, Latino working class, and other kinds of immigrant areas, you know, where people are just really like the targets of this. So, you know, fighting and organizing along those kinds of issues that, you know, aren't directly workplace issues, but, you know, really are very, very important to working class people in general, but, you know, especially a place like where I live, particularly important to immigrants and working people of color, I think is huge. And yeah, hopefully, at least in kind of the way I think about this, that has a knock-on effect into, you know, things that people will then hopefully take with them into their workplaces and into their unions. The last thing I would just say super quickly is hopefully through that work, we're also able to organize more people into DSA itself. And I think that doing something like that, if we can, you know, bring more and more people into the organization, you know, from every conceivable background, then that'll help, I hope, you know, our ability to, you know, organize people at work, in unions, and everywhere. It's not going to be easy, but there's, I think, a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, and it's a good chance to plug another event. I think we did that at the beginning, but I'll just say it again. July 18th, another event on the resolutions on multiracial and anti-racist organizing, and Ashley Payne is actually involved in one of those resolutions. So just to tease this out a little bit, yes, Black workers are among the most, or the most unionized, and at the same time in Amazon in Alabama, at least one account I read, there was resistance to the union effort, especially among young Black workers. So can we say a little more about how to address that specifically, because our audience members were asking sort of these related questions, I'll also just put this in about Amazon. Is there something to organizing in Amazon towards a regular contract, rather than what the questioner says is like a last mile kind of model at warehouses that can appear and disappear quickly? So, yeah.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I mean, I think something to keep in mind about the Bessemer result is that the majority of workers eligible did not vote. And further, hundreds were commuted primarily by Amazon. So there's probably a much closer margin than we see right now. Let's keep that in mind. But to the point of, younger Black workers, I don't see the data, but I don't think young Black workers are going to have much of a difference between young white workers in having hesitance to join a union. I think that speaks more to the political climate around labor organizing in the South. But my coworkers, probably the average age is about 30. Our warehouse is 99% Black and Latino. And some of the people that have been most agitated and most ready to circulate a petition on our shift have been, Black coworkers in their early 20s. So I don't think there's any sort of inherent issue there. I think rather what we should be focusing on is the fact that frequently civil rights and labor rights are not brought together fully in the way that we saw in past decades, where if those bonds had been stronger, if labor had done a better job, frankly, of truly being intertwined with the civil rights movements, maybe we'd be in a better position than we are right now. But last summer, when the protests regarding George Floyd were happening, that's also when energy was at its peak in one of our warehouses here in New York. I think my co-organizers in Queens, this is before I had started, but did a fantastic job of talking about how Amazon is really one and the same with the police state. They're the ones selling Ring camera data to local departments. They're the ones using artificial intelligence, facial recognition technology that discriminates against Black folks. There's a lot there. And I think the better job we do highlighting how some of these various injustices can be, to some extent, addressed through labor organizing, we really need to drive that home and make that apparent and show that we can win. Because that's how you get those younger workers that don't realize the benefit of a union. That's how we kind of instill that in a new generation that doesn't see union households left and right like we once did in this country.
Yeah, just super briefly, I think when it comes to this question and almost any other question too, I think that at least from where I'm sitting and what I can see, the biggest issue here is our ability or inability, depending on the situation, to show people that this is a movement, this is an organization, et cetera, that can actually make a real positive material difference in people's lives. It's like, I can go out there to the subway station, like down the street. I actually went out there a couple of days ago with a couple of my comrades here in our Central Brooklyn branch. talk to people about politics, talk to people about what's going on in the world, it's very rare that you're going to find someone who's just going to like flat out disagree with what it is that we have to say about these things. You know, this is a heavily, you know, working class area for the most part. And, you know, it's very mixed in terms of people's racial background and also their national origin. You know, most of the people that we talk to, they're almost always on board with what it is that we have to say. The question is, it's like, are we people who can actually do something about that and make a real contribution in making people's lives better, or you know, are we just out here, you know, talking about stuff? So, you know, I think that we will be able to make more and more headway on this question in terms of organizing Black and brown workers, you know, into the labor movement or into the working class movement, or whether you're talking about DSA. If we can show people that, yes, not only are we going to show up to, you know, things, events, protests, demonstrations that we need to show up at, but also, can we change people's lives? Can we make a contribution to changing people's lives? And here in New York, I think through some of the great work that our chapter has been able to do over the last few years, in, you know, the thing that gets the most attention, I think, is electing people. But in addition to electing people, you know, the organizing that we've been able to do to, you know, to make some really like actual improvements in people's lives. The biggest thing that I can point to is probably the rent laws that were passed in New York State a couple of years ago that, you know, really that brought a lot more housing units into public regulation and cracked down on some of the worst things that that landlords do. You know, it's something that everyone knows about, and it's something that, to I think a certain extent here locally, is associated, at least in part, you know, with us and with kind of democratic socialism in general. And I think that that's helped to get the ball rolling in terms of, you know, having our organization, our movement have a broader appeal than, you know, it may have had a few years ago, or, you know, really before we were able to really start demonstrating to people that this is a movement that can actually improve people's lives. So I think, you know, more than anything else, it's not so much like convincing people to agree with us, you know, especially when you're talking about, you know, young, you know, Black working class people, especially like, you know, Black working class women. You know, it's like, there's not a whole lot of convincing you have to do, you know, on that score. It's like, can you actually do something about it? And, you know, I think if we can demonstrate an ability to do that, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but I think it will open the door wider.
Okay, well, I was going to do the rest of the Q&A, but I think given the time, I think the best thing to do at this moment would be to ask each of the panelists to make brief final comments about a labor strategy for DSA. Try and keep it to 3 minutes or so, and I'll start with Ashley.
Okay. I think just most importantly is just building that layer of shop floor organizers again. So building those leaders in the workplace. It's the identity, the working class cuts across so many different identities around race and gender, religion, etc. It's the place that most oftentimes you're going to run into people that aren't in your natural social milieu, and organizing there is, you know, the primary place to do that work, because now you're also in a place where class politics are first and, you know, of your mind. It's right there in the forefront of your mind. You have to battle the boss on daily things like making sure your paycheck is correct, but also battle the boss on making sure that you don't get evicted from your home during a pandemic. I mean, there's just so many things around PPE. So I am looking forward to the next couple of years in the labor movement, just because I think through the pandemic, you can sort of see the sort of torrential, sort of huge shift and mindset around work. I think people are really reevaluating the value of their lives and thinking about their relationship to work and, you know, their value in that space. And so I'm hoping that we actually start to see a lot more worker organizing and worker activity actually during these next couple of years. I'm thinking of it a lot in the same way, you know, there was a lull during World War II, you know, there was, you know, sort of a labor peace, and then we saw the biggest strike activity in 1946, right after the war ended. And I'm wondering and hoping that we see something similar coming out of the pandemic, because I think people are really thinking about, wow, health and safety in my life is, working conditions are extremely poor. And I think people have really started working on that and reflecting and sort of disentangling their identity from work as well. I think, a lot of people self-identify with work in a way that probably isn't healthy, and actually need to be looking at sort of material issues and seeing if like this is a way to live in the world, if we can organize society differently. Because we really should come out of the pandemic with Medicare for all and a Green New Deal and all of these things. And I think the terrain is really ripe for that.
Thank you. Cody.
Thank you. Yeah, frankly, we can't afford to be bystanders. I think that's what it boils down to for me. It's great that DSA is growing. That's exciting. But we also need to recognize that we can be at the forefront of this resurgence of the labor movement. We should be actively involving ourselves in these organizing campaigns, and sitting on the sidelines cheerleading, not to be dismissive, just it's not enough. We can do better. Committed folks are needed, and that can very well be the difference between an upswing and some major wins in the labor movement, or just more of the disappointment that we've seen over the past decades of unions that are just scraping by, doing enough to secure things for their own members' immediate future, but simply not taking on the new organizing that is so desperate for unions with the crisis of economic equality that we have in this country. So if you want to move boxes, and if you don't want to move boxes, but you know someone that could, let us know. NYC@AmazoniansUnited.org. We need you.
Chris.
Sure. Thanks again to the organizers, and thanks again to my fellow panelists and everyone here. It's been great way to spend part of my day. Yeah, the only thing I think I would underline at this point, we've already covered a lot of territory, is just, at least, for me, and I think that probably everyone here and most people, in and around DSA are probably just, adopting as our goal, our main kind of goal, bringing together however we can, and to the extent that it's possible, socialists and working people in their organizations and their movements. I don't think there's any one way to go about doing that. I agree with Cody, in many instances that's going to have to entail, people themselves taking a job, being there and doing that work, side by side with people, so that they can get a better sense of what it is, to do this kind of work today, especially in these extremely important and strategic and just like awful companies like Amazon. And then also just to, give ourselves as many opportunities as possible to make relationships with people, spread our ideas, and not just, tell people what it is that we think, but really absorb from them what their lives are like, to understand what it is that they go through, and so that we can take that back into our own work, outside of our workplaces and our organizations, and into, DSA and whatever it is we're doing. In other cases, it's like if someone isn't willing or able to do that kind of work, I think there's all kinds of opportunities for them to just try to be out there and to be talking to and working with and fighting alongside of working people, whether they're in a union or not, whether they're already convinced socialists or not. There's no shortage of issues, problems, needs, what have you, that working people out there have today. In many ways, the country is, and Noam Chomsky used to say this all the time, it's an organizer's paradise. One of the silver linings, if you want to call it that, of how terrible life is in America for many people, is that if you're someone that wants to go ahead and change that, you've got you've got a smorgasbord of issues and problems to choose from. Just trying to joke a little bit about that. But the point is, there's people I think really want change in their lives, whether it's at work or elsewhere. I think that in many cases, people out there are willing to give us a hearing, at the very least. I think the main challenge that we have to overcome is people's fatalism and anti-politics, and to help people realize that, hey, actually, life, work, politics, these are not things that just happen to me. This is something that together with the people I work with, the people I live with, the people I go to school with, I can organize alongside with them, and we can come together and really change things. I'm not just somebody who has to sit here and just take whatever life doles out. Just anything that you can do to reestablish these connections with working people and their movements that have been severed over the years. That's where we need to be.
All right, thank you so much. And I just wanted to also make sure that we were able to squeeze in a quick UAWD plug. Lisa, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first I want to say I didn't inject too much of my opinion into the panel, but I really do like the labor resolution. I think it's very comprehensive, and I hope people take a look at it. And as far as UAWD goes, so as I mentioned before, UAWD stands for Unite All Workers for Democracy. We're a rank and file reform caucus in the UAW, which is still majority auto workers and manufacturing workers, but also has a lot of workers in higher ed, legal services, and public sector workers as well. So if there are any UAW members on this call, I would really encourage you to read more about us, as well as the referendum vote on adopting direct elections of top officers in the UAW. That's going to be coming later this year. The UAW, I think, is just, I think everyone knows about its storied history, and, in this country, unfortunately, it's really fallen from those heights. Two former presidents of the UAW have recently been sentenced to prison for their role in a massive corruption scandal. Corruption is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's really about a lack of rank and file empowerment and democracy in the union. And I'm also going to drop a link to the pledge to pledge your support for adopting direct elections of these top leaders. So this is for UAW members. And I'll also say since I've been organizing with auto workers in UAWD, I've really seen up front how, rank and file strategy tactics have really benefited the union over the long term, because I'm organizing with activists who took jobs in the plants to be in the struggle, back in like the 70s and the 80s. And, now they're still fighting for reform in the union. So it's really inspiring. So that is my plug, and I'm going to drop a link to the pledge for any UAW members on the call. Thanks, Michaela.
Yep. Of course. So I just wanted to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you so much to our panelists, Ashley, Chris, Cody, and our lovely and talented moderator, Lisa. And for those of you who joined the call, we're going to record it and we'll put it in those places where you find DSA recordings, which isn't the most organized actually, but hopefully you'll be able to find it. And please do share it with people in your chapters or comrades of yours, particularly those who want to get involved more with the labor side of DSA. I think that because of the weakness of the labor movement, which we touched on quite a lot during this call, I think that it's just something that people feel like they just can't get a hold of and really know like how to enter it. But I think that the discussion we had today really kind of gets at a lot of the inroads. And also, even if you're not a delegate to the convention, you can still, hash over the resolution number 5 to talk about what DSA is going to do and wants to do and ought to do in order to build worker power and win socialism. So thanks everybody. And we will end the call now.